Welcome everyone to our CBPR Workshop number 3 presented by the Research Infrastructure Core here at UCR. And so this workshop is going to be all about human subjects research and the IRB process. And it's really targeted toward individuals with no prior human subjects research experience. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So just a reminder of our workshop schedule. This is the third in our series, and we originally had 4 workshops planned, but since then we've expanded it to 7. So we've still got some really great topics coming up. We've got a presentation of the HARC data set by Jenna, and we've got basic analytical techniques and experimental design. So once you have some data, what do you do with it, right? And then we've got some really great networking events coming up as well. So definitely keep those in mind and keep those on your calendar. So today's workshop agenda is first to talk about what an IRB is, an IRB application, the Institutional Review Board itself. And then I will walk you through an IRB just so that you know what you're dealing with and what each of the sections looks like. And then we'll talk about some community-based participatory research recruitment challenges and tips. So challenges that are unique to CBPR and some tips for how to deal with those. Okay. So before we get started, I wanted just to reintroduce ourselves as we do at each workshop. So I will go first. I'm Pamela. I'm a postdoctoral scholar in psychology. I'm a developmental psychologist, and I study motivational factors in learning. And as part of the Research Infrastructure Core, I help medical students with their research design and statistical analyses. And I also create statistical learning materials for the research community. And so I'm really happy to be presenting this workshop today on the IRB for you all. And Sam, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam. I'm an assistant professor in environmental science department, and I'm also the core lead for research and infrastructure at HDR.
Thank you, Sam. And Cecilia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cecilia Chung. I'm an associate professor of psychology. I study children's motivation and social factors that affect their motivation. So at the Research Infrastructure Core, I assist individuals with questions about research design or data analysis. So it's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Great, thank you, Cecilia. And Jenna.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna LeCount-Heinley. I am the CEO of HARC, which stands for Health Assessment and Research for Communities. I fortunately don't do many IRBs, so I will be hands-off during this one, but one of the next workshops is all about the data set that I can share with you, and I will be leading that. So thank you all for being here, and we're excited to have you interested in CBPR.
Thank you, Jenna. Yes, we are so excited. So to begin, we'll now do a poll to learn a little bit more about you guys. And so I believe I have it as a Zoom poll. I had to kind of make it last minute with this one. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the Zoom poll, but you can also answer in the chat. So these are the questions. So we want to know, how much experience do you have with human subjects research? Have you ever completed an IRB application? And what challenges did you face if you have completed an IRB application? So let me go ahead and launch those questions. You should see those on your screen now. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and we're going to now shift focus and talk about what an IRB is for those newbies who are not even sure what it is or have no experience working with human subjects. Okay, so to begin, IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, and it's defined as a designated group that reviews and monitors research involving human subjects. Institutional review boards were established in response to numerous unethical research studies involving human subjects that were conducted, the most infamous ones being studies such as those horrible Nazi biomedical experiments during World War II and the Tuskegee syphilis experiment from 1932 to 1972, in which nearly 400 Black men diagnosed with syphilis were left untreated even after a cure was found. And so very, very unethical experiments conducted on human subjects. And so after those experiences and many, many others, they realized something had to be done, right? And so the IRB aims to protect the rights and the welfare of human subjects in research. And it adheres to 3 general principles of the Belmont Report. So respect for persons, so protecting people's autonomy and their rights, beneficence, maximizing benefits for science, humanity, and research participants, while avoiding or minimizing risk or harm. So maximizing benefits, minimizing risk as much as possible. And then justice, ensuring that there's a fair distribution among persons and groups of the costs and benefits of research. So who is benefiting from this research? Not just the researcher, but hopefully the participants as well in that community as well. And that's what CBPR really is all about, benefiting the community. And so there are 2 general types of IRB application at UCR. So you have to submit an application to the Institutional Review Board, and they have the authority to reject a study. They can say, no, this is not ethical. You're not going through with this, or they can approve it. And there are these 2 general types. So there's the socio-behavioral, and that is the one that I'm going to walk you through today, because that one you will most likely need for a CBPR study, but you may have more intensive biomedical data you're collecting, in which case you will need the clinical biomedical IRB. But today we're going to talk about the socio-behavioral, because for many CBPR studies, that's all you'll need. Okay. So that's just a little introduction to the IRB. And now we're going to talk about whether you need an IRB at all. So this infographic was provided by UCR IRB, and it's really great at helping you determine whether your research study needs an IRB. In general, if your study involves human subjects, then you need IRB approval. But sometimes there are these kind of more fuzzier cases where you are using a data set where it is data from human subjects, but it's already been collected, or there's some pre-existing data set, or you're requesting data from another source that contains data from human subjects, in which case you may need to fill out an IRB. So there are some of those cases where it's kind of, you're not sure. So if you're ever uncertain, you should just contact the UCR Institutional Review Board to make sure. But if you're collecting new data, if you're designing a brand new CBPR study, then absolutely you will need an IRB. Okay. And knowing which type of IRB is also really important. So once you know, hey, I need IRB approval, but which type do I need? So as I mentioned, there are these 2 general types, the socio-behavioral and clinical biomedical. And so with CBPR, you probably will be doing some sort of combination of focus groups. They're very common in CBPR, surveys and interviews. So that first one there. And for just those, that's fine to have the socio-behavioral, right? That's totally fine. But if you add something else, like if you're adding any kind of biological information or doing anything physical to that participant's body, that's when you're going to need the clinical biomedical. So if you're doing blood draws, application of heat, cold, electric current, anything like that, if you're collecting biological samples or biopsies, if you are using an EEG, EKG, or some other medical device, then you're going to need that clinical biomedical one. And then also administering electric shock. If you're doing something like one of the old school psychology studies, you will need that as well. Anything that you're doing that to that person's body. But if you're just collecting data or administering surveys about health or medical information, so say you're investigating some health disparity, and if you're just collecting information and you're not actually doing something, then it's fine just to do the socio-behavioral. Or if you are having participants report how they are feeling about using a medical device or using a drug without actually asking them to take a drug or to use a device, then that's also socio-behavioral. So that's just them reporting their feelings. But if you are at all asking them to report, if you request that information, if you ask how they feel, but if you're asking them to use any kind of drug or device, then it goes back to the clinical domain, okay? So always good to kind of keep those in mind. If you're not sure about your study that you have in mind, definitely contact IRB to get more information on that. But those are just general rules of thumb there. Are there any questions on that? No questions? Okay, great. So the link is there if you'd like to learn more about that. So now we're going to go ahead and do a IRB walkthrough of the socio-behavioral type. So this is the one that I'm most familiar with, being a psychologist. And so we'll walk you guys through this one. So the first page is the section 1, general information. This first section is really straightforward, and it just has all the basic information that you like: the study title, the research personnel, the training, other than city training, which is a required part of training that's listed in the roster. You also want to include funding information and conflicts of interest. So you can see here that you've got the title of your research study, all the researcher, the head researcher. So whether you're faculty, student, postdoc, visiting professor, UCR status. So for myself, I would put postdoc. And then also note here that if you are a graduate student, postdoc, or undergrad, you will need a UCR faculty advisor or sponsor. So you have to have that sponsor. So even for myself being a postdoc, I need to have a faculty sponsor sign on to that study before as I'm completing the IRB application. Okay, so just something important to keep in mind. You don't want to go rogue and just do your own thing without faculty support. So that, and then this is continued the section 1. So also you'll need the key personnel. So you want to list everybody involved. This includes research assistants, anybody involved in the consent or assent process. And with CBPR, oftentimes you will have community members who are involved in the consent process. And so you'll want to list them here as well. So you want to list them all in the project roster. That's a separate document that you attach. And then you'll also want to list training. So this includes any other specialized training apart from city training, like using an MRI or something like that, you list here. And then funding as well, whether your study's funded. With CBPR, we like to reimburse participants. That's very important. So definitely be sure to secure, or hopefully secure, funding for that. And then number 8 is conflict of interest review. So if there's any conflict of interest, you want to report that there. And then if there's been any additional review by faculty supervisor or a funder or departmental committee, you'll need to specify that as well. So those are just the general information and just very straightforward section. Are there any questions on that section? No, pretty straightforward, right? All right. So section 2 looks really short, but it can actually be quite time consuming. So this is the study summary. And this section is the most scholarly part of the IRB. And so it speaks to really the planning and the intentionality of your study. So you'll need to provide an abstract first that is suitable for a lay audience. So you don't want any of that fancy jargon in there. You want to make sure that the IRB can understand what your study is about in that quick abstract. And then you'll also want to provide the scholarly rationale. So you'll want to talk about, what has past research shown on this topic? Why is it important? How will the study advance knowledge, address gaps in literature, or help the population understudy? And with CBPR, you really want to focus on how it will help the population, right? Because that's what CBPR is all about. And then finally, I put this one in red because this one's very important. This is your study hypotheses or research questions. So these need to be thought over very carefully because they really heavily inform the survey design. So you want to think about the information that you want to gain from the study and the types of analyses that you're going to be conducting. So if you want to compare groups on outcome variables, you're hypothesizing that one group will show better health outcomes than another group, and you want to do something like a t-test or a ANOVA, you need continuous variables that are measured on a Likert scale or a sliding scale. You need to have that so that you can actually do that in your analyses. But if you just want to describe percentages or frequencies, you just want to see what percentage of individuals reported having this vaccine or something, then it might be okay just to have yes or no, just to have categorical data. But really you want to make sure that your data matches what your hypotheses are and what you expect to find and what you want to find there. So that should really, that really heavily informs the survey design. And so you want to think very carefully about your study hypotheses and what you really want to find from this study, what you expect to get out of it. Okay, so that is the study summary section. Any questions on that section before we move on? No? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to section 3, study design and methodology. So this one is a really big section. This is the real meat of the IRB. And so for this one, this one involves the study plan and procedure. It involves recruitment details, and it also involves consent, assent processes, reimbursement of participants, debriefing of participants, and confidentiality and privacy issues, and then also potential risk to the participants. So a lot of stuff going on here. So looking at these sections, you can see that the study timeline you'll want to include, and it's better to have a more conservative estimate. You don't want to say, oh, I'm going to start next week, because it can take many, many months to get IRB approval. So just keep that in mind when you're putting an estimated start date. You'll want to include the location of the research. So where is the study going to take place? Is there going to be an online component? Then you have to provide the details here. For example, my dissertation took place totally over Zoom because it was during the pandemic. So I had to put those details that it would be conducted fully on Zoom. And then here I put this one in red because it's important. So if research is taking place within a community or an organization, you want to describe how that access will be obtained. So are there special considerations for obtaining consent? And often with CBPR, you'll want to work from the inside and have community members involved in the consent process. Sometimes that has been found to be more effective than having outside researchers. So you may need an access letter that you can request for that. From that community may request an access letter from you to get permission. And you can find some templates on the resources page from the IRB. So you can click on that link, or if you go to the IRB, then you can open this file and then click on that link, or you can also get to it different ways. So you can find that template there. And then also the participant population. So you want to describe the participants and subjects. You want to list all inclusion, exclusion criteria. So is there a language barrier? Are you only allowing participants who speak English, or will you be translating surveys into Spanish, for example? And if so, you need to provide those translated surveys appended to this document. So you have to have all translations, all materials that you're going to show participants need to be appended to this document. So definitely keep that in mind and have some justification for why you may have some exclusion criteria. So why participants have to be a certain age, why they have to speak a certain language. Perhaps you're studying only Spanish-speaking participants, then you need to explain why you are doing that. Okay, so that is the participant population section. And then special populations involve participants who may be more vulnerable. So participants under the age of 18, or prisoners, probationers, parolees, pregnant women, fetuses. Those more vulnerable populations should be listed here if you are involving those in your study. And so with children under the age of 18, being a developmentalist in the Culture and Child Development Lab, we often do research with children, and that involves a separate assent process in addition to the consent process. So parents will consent to the study, and they'll say it's okay for my child to be involved in the study, but we also want the child to assent to the study and say, yeah, it's okay for me to be involved. The parent really is doing the consent because the child's under age 18, but the child should be okay with the study as well. So if you're involving child participants, you'll need to make sure you have a separate consent and assent form. And then recruitment, so you want to describe the mode of communication and how participants will be approached. So any recruitment materials, emails, and scripts, they have to be appended to the document. And you'll also want to know, they'll want to know if you're using the subject pool, the psychology subject pool, for example. So here, you want to talk about all the things you'll be doing with emails. If you're using flyers, if you're using, even if you're just calling up participants, you'll need to have a script, a phone script for exactly what you're going to say in that phone conversation. So all that detail needs to be provided there, and you should list it here and then provide it in further detail when you actually append the documents. Compensation, so you want to describe how participants will be compensated. Are they going to get a gift card? Are they going to get a cash reimbursement? Are they going to get some other form of compensation? And also you want to describe what happens if they choose to withdraw from the study. So sometimes participants don't want to complete the full study, and you will have some attrition, they'll drop out. And so you want to have protocol in mind for if they drop out, do they still get compensated? Perhaps if they complete 50% of the study, they get compensated. If they don't get compensated. You'll need to work around that and have a protocol in mind. And then reimbursement. So you want to know more about, you want to provide more detail about whether there will be any expenses as a result of participation. So fuel expenses, missed work, and you want to definitely examine those. And particularly in CBPR, if you're involving community members and you're having them help with recruitment, you also want to detail any kind of expenses they may be incurring and how you might reimburse them for that. Next, you want to talk about the procedure. So you want to discuss if there's going to be an intervention or interaction with the participants. This part is maximum half a page. This is a pretty lengthy section here. So you want to discuss the procedure in detail, exactly what you're going to be doing with those participants. If you're starting out with a focus group for CBPR, you'll have to submit this IRB application as a focus group and discuss in detail what that focus group entails. And so that's the procedure section. The deception section, you want to discuss whether there's deception or intentional lack of disclosure. This is often the case with experimental studies. For my dissertation, I was a little bit deceptive. I lied to some teens about how they scored on a problem-solving task. And so there was a little bit of deception involved there. And then I had to debrief them after the study and say, oh, you know, that's not really how you scored on that, right? That was just manipulated feedback. So you definitely want to disclose that. With CBPR, probably, I mean, hopefully you don't have deception too much unless you're doing some sort of manipulation and you have to have some sort of deception in some way of not telling them something or telling them something that's false. But in many CBPR studies, I don't think there's too much deception. For research results, you want to describe what information will be provided to the subjects and communities. So will there be a pamphlet that's created to help disseminate information to lay people? Will there be articles? And then also, how will they be able to access the information? Also, how will they be debriefed? And then the consent process here, there is an informed consent guide that you can see at UCR. So there's sample informed consent templates that you can find on the resources page. So you have to describe the exact process that will be used, how it will be recorded. And if you're doing it online, you'll want to provide links to using that online platform. So for some of my studies, I've used JotForm, which provides a link and you can provide consent on an online form. And it's very easy to keep track of the consent form. So I recommend JotForm, but in CBPR, sometimes you will need to forego traditional consent processes. So for example, in a study that they did, Hansa and colleagues did a study looking at a nutrition intervention with Hispanic immigrant and Somali and Sudanese refugee populations. And they found that the consent process had to be altered a little bit to provide just oral consent and to provide alternate ways other than just an online form. So sometimes you need to alter the ways in which you gather consent. So there's also some sections dealing with that. If you're applying for a waiver of consent, do it verbally, online, etc. And then you also want to provide detail on whether or not you're collecting data from children and they can't provide consent, their parents do. So you want to discuss that and discuss the assent form that the children will be completing. So that's some more about that. And then the next part of this section deals with if a participant chooses to withdraw. So if they want to drop out of the study, what will you do with their data? And so will you destroy their data? Will the previous data be kept? What will happen if they say, I don't want you to use any of my data? Maybe you recorded them, maybe you recorded an interview and then they say, I'm not comfortable sharing that interview. What will you do with that data if they drop out? And so, generally we will say we destroy that data. We're not going to keep it because you do not give your consent for us to use it anymore. And then more information on privacy, confidentiality, and data. So where and how will the participants be providing information? Are they collecting identifying information like names, addresses, phone numbers? So oftentimes for reimbursement, you do need to collect some identifying information. So for example, you may have to collect an email address so that you can send them an electronic gift card, for example. And so in that case, you want to make sure that you are always de-identifying data so that their email address is not connected to their survey data when you reimburse them. There's a whole separate, we could provide a whole separate workshop on de-identifying data, but that's a really important part here just to keep in mind. And so you also want to provide for protecting their confidentiality. That's all about electronic storage of the data, how long the data will be stored. So, are you going to keep it for 2 years, 5 years? Where will it be stored? Is it going to be on a hard drive? Is it going to be on a password protected computer? You should be thinking about all those things to make sure that that data is confidential. And we have a note in the chat, anonymous and confidential are two very different things. Oh, that's important to know. Yeah, thank you, Jenna. If you want to, can you speak more on that?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people sort of use this, use the terms as if they are synonymous, and they're not. So anonymous is there is no chance that anyone, not you, not your supervisor, not anyone will ever be able to say, this was Juanita's survey. That means you didn't collect their name, you didn't collect their address, you didn't collect anything. If you did give them an incentive, maybe you gave it to them instantly on the spot because you didn't ask for their email address. You literally, no one at any point could ever tell who this is. That's anonymous. And then confidential is saying that you do have some identifying information. Maybe you keep it in a separate file and they're only connected by like an identification number or something. Obviously, you're not reporting in your report, Juanita said, blah, 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 right? You are still reporting in mass, but in theory, there is a possible way that someone could put it 2 and 2 together and figure out that this is Juanita's survey. And so that is a different level of feeling safe, right? So if it's something like, I feel sad today, I'm probably fine with I don't care if Pamela can look at my survey and see that I feel sad today. If it's something really sensitive, like about my my history of drug use, or have I broken the law? That I might be like, I don't ever want worst case scenario, what if somebody hacks that secure server and finds this out? That would be really damaging to me. I don't feel comfortable taking this survey if it's not completely anonymous.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. I did not know that myself.
Christina added something too. This is another thing. Qualtrics and many other SurveyMonkey online survey things, their default setting is to collect the IP address, the internet protocol address of the person who takes it. And so you have to manually go in. If you want to say this survey is anonymous, you have to manually go in and deactivate that. Really good point, Christina, because otherwise you can't say that's anonymous.
Yes, great point. Yeah, you definitely have to. That is the default setting. And so even if you think it's anonymous, it really isn't. Yeah, great. Thank you. That's excellent points. So yes, very important. This privacy confidentiality section, very, very important. To take note of that and to investigate Qualtrics to make sure your survey is really anonymous if you're saying that it's anonymous. And then the next section, you want to talk about possible risks to the participants. So if they're going to be physical risks, psychological, emotional risks, social risks, and legal risks. So for the socio-behavioral, we often will check the box that if there are psychological, emotional risk involved. So feeling emotionally upset or uncomfortable. When I'm working with adolescents, sometimes they get upset about if we manipulate their score on a problem-solving task, they'll get upset saying, I didn't do very well on that task. And so there's a little bit of emotional risk involved there, but we always like to emphasize that it's nothing that would be beyond what they would typically experience in everyday settings, like in school. So if you can argue that it's nothing beyond what someone would typically experience, a normal day-to-day thing, then that's a strong argument for why there's not much of a risk involved. But you definitely want to detail that here. And then possible benefits is something that's very important. So describing possible direct benefits to participants. Note here that compensation is not a benefit. Compensation is just paying them back for their time. It's just compensation, right? A benefit would be, how can you actually improve the health outcomes for that community? What are you actually doing for them with your research? So if there are no benefits, then you need to say there are no benefits. But with CBPR, a core tenet is that there are benefits to the community that you foresee. So just important to keep that in mind. And then number 29, the regulations define minimal risk. So you want to talk about if it's minimal risk or not. So if you just anticipate slight psychological emotional risk and you believe it's minimal, you want to discuss that here, like I said, with talking about how it's something that they may experience in their everyday life. It's nothing that's beyond what is typical. So it is minimal risk. But then it's up to them to really decide if that's minimal risk or not. So they may say, no, that goes beyond minimal risk. We don't like the sound of that. Okay. And then lastly here for number 30, you want to provide a list of appendices for all additional materials submitted with the IRB application. So the informed consent, interview guide, references, flyers, materials, and everything. So that's that section. Any questions on that before I jump into the last section? Or comments you want to share? No questions? All right, we'll jump into the last section. This one's easy. So, I mean, depending on how easy it is to get signatures, I guess. So this one's all about signatures. So in addition to your signature as a researcher, you need your UCR faculty sponsor signature. And then you also need the chair or dean signature. So there's your researcher signature, faculty advisor signature, and the chair dean signature. So make sure you get those signatures. And then you might think, oh, I'm all done. But really, the biggest part of the IRB process, at least for me, I have a question here. What if you're late applying to IRB? Oh, what do you mean by that, Basima?
Basically, what if you applied for the IRB, but then you needed more papers, and by that time the study started, and it was supposed to be an exempt study, but UCR, of course, still requires the IRB application. Would that be like how much of an issue that would be?
So if it's exempt from an IRB, then you should be able to start the study. But if IRB has gotten back to you, do you mean that IRB gets back to you and says, no, you actually need an IRB approval?
No, just more information that that were not submitted at the time.
Oh, in that case, you can submit an amendment and then they can get back to you, and you can always make changes. So if there's something you left out and you say, oh, I really wanted to add this, then you can submit an amendment, and usually amendments don't take as long as the original application.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So then you need the signatures. Oh, Cecilia, you have a question?
I just wanted to add to the previous question. So technically, any study shouldn't be, you shouldn't start any studies before you receive official approval from the IRB, even if it's a exempt study. So you have to have that page from IRB saying that this is an exempt study, and you do not actually need some sort of kind of assurance that, this is indeed a study that you can go ahead without needing to go through the IRB process. That's needed even before you start a study of that nature. So I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, you definitely don't want to be doing a study until you get that, even if it's exempt. Yeah, Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. Okay. So this is the hard part, in my opinion, is the roster and the appendices. So you think you're done with all the signatures, and then you realize, oh, I have to append all this material. So that section that I detailed with all the stuff you have to add, this is where you add it right at the end. And so you'll want to include the project roster, and this details everyone who's going to be involved in the study. And city training is required. So city stands for Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. And it's this ethical human subjects training that's required for every researcher dealing with human subjects. And so you can find the link here, and we'll be sending these slides out after the workshop today. So you can click on that link, and it's just an online workshop, very brief, and you get the certificate at the end that says you're city certified. And then you can send that. You don't need to send that, but you need to put on the form that you're city training certified. And if you're an RA working in a lab, you'll maybe need to provide proof of that with your certificate. Let's see here. Yes, grad students can be. Thank you for answering that, Cecilia. Yes, can recent UCR grads participate in IRB submission? Yes. And so you'll need that city training for everyone involved. And the roster also involves, you want to talk about what step each person is doing. So are you involved in consent? Are you involved in data analysis? Are you involved in data collection? You'll want to detail that in the roster. And then you'll want to include all your surveys. So here I have some examples of survey. These are surveys that I used for my dissertation, the virtual learning project, and it was all conducted on Zoom with adolescents. And so it was not a CBPR study, but it was conducted on minors. So that's a special population, but it was not CBPR. I wish it had been. That would be really cool. So you'll want to include all of your surveys. And I like to put them in hard copy like this, but some people will put them on Qualtrics first just to save time, and then sort of export them from Qualtrics and have a document that way. There are different ways to do it, but I like to just kind of have them in a Word document and then transfer them to Qualtrics while I'm waiting for the study to be approved or after it's approved. So whichever way is faster for you. Qualtrics is a great program. Other people use things like SurveyMonkey, but I highly recommend Qualtrics. And so you want to attach all of your surveys. And then scripts are very important as well. So like I said, if you're calling people to participate in your study, you need a phone script. If you're reaching out at an event, you need and you have a flyer, you need to attach the flyer. If you're going to be interacting with participants in a certain way for an experimental study and you're saying a certain thing to them, you'll need a researcher script for exactly how you're going to introduce yourselves. If you're bringing participants into a lab setting, you want to walk them through each step of that process from the minute they walk in the door into your lab to when they are debriefed. So you also want the debriefing forms of how you're going to reveal any deception or what the study was actually about. And so you want to detail all that in the researcher script. And so you'll need, you may need contact letters as well. So reaching out to that community, and phone script, as I said, and a researcher script. So every single detail, just imagine you're doing the study right now. You need every detail of that study to be detailed here so that the IRB has that information. And then consent and assent forms. As I said, I have the parent consent form shown here. I also used a child assent form, so we had separate forms for the parent to sign and the child to sign. And I used JOT form. I think that's a really great program. But with CBPR, you may need hard copies. You may need to get oral consent instead of written consent. And so there are alternate ways to get consent, but you'll detail that in that previous section. So let's see. We have some other questions. Oh, students no longer attending UCR. I know that we have worked with students who aren't even UCR students. I mean, I worked with high school students, and even high school students from different high schools outside of the Inland Empire have completed UCR IRB applications with a faculty supervisor. So it is potentially okay to do that, but you need that faculty supervisor and you need to be connected to the community in some way, right? Okay, so yeah, that is possible. And so then any other study materials you have, if you have a study apparatus that you want to include, any kind of other thing that you should let the IRB know about, you should include here as well. So that should also be there. And then once you have all that information, you know your study forwards and backwards, and you know all the details of it, and you're just ready to go, then you submit it. And then you have to be patient and wait a long, long time. Usually it's a very, very time-consuming process for the committee to review your application. And oftentimes they will have revisions that they suggest, and then they'll send it back to you. You'll have to make a bunch of changes to the application. Then you'll send it back to them. There might be a couple rounds of revisions, similar to publishing a paper, right? And so there's this big revision process, and then at a certain point, hopefully they approve your IRB application. And then once you get the go ahead, you can start doing your study. Are there any questions before we move on to challenges and tips? No questions? All right, let's go ahead and move on now. So now we'll talk about some recruitment challenges and tips. So first is accessing the community. So we've been getting this question a lot in both our post-workshop attendance survey and just during our workshops that, you know, I want to do CBPR, but where do I begin? And that can be a tricky question to answer. So it does help to have an inside connection to the community that you're interested in working with. But if not, a good place to start is to look possibly at current projects underway at our Health Disparities Research Center, and then perhaps team up with someone or look at other UCR affiliated organizations. We have many in the Inland Empire. And also Jenna from HART can help you get connected with data and with local communities. Jenna has so many connections to local communities. So definitely reach out to Jenna, as she mentioned in one of our previous workshops. If you're interested in looking at, you know, the LGBTQ plus community or BIPOC older adults, you know, whoever that may be, Jenna has a connection for you. Okay, so, and we'll talk more about that, or Jenna will, in a future workshop with the HART data set. The next is contacting participants. So we know that it's best actually to recruit from the inside with CBPR. So this means that you employ teams of families or other community members that you have helping you with the recruitment process. So in the study by Hamza and colleagues that I mentioned with the Hispanic immigrant and Somali and Sudanese refugee populations, they found that recruitment needed to be really widespread and it needed to be from the inside. So they started out actually with families, that they teamed up with families, and those families led the recruitment. So they went into those populations and they went to community events. They did not have an outside researcher going in and saying, hi, I'm from UCR and I'm studying this. Do you want to sign up for my study? They had it all from the inside, and they worked with them to help get participants, to help them with the consent process. So you definitely want multiple methods of recruitment: flyers, emails, social media, all kinds of methods, however ways you can reach them. And also they found that multiple contacts can be really important too. So calling those participants numerous times, you know, not harassing them or anything like that, but definitely keeping in close contact with them rather than just, hi, can you fill out this study? And then they never hear from you again. Fill out the survey and then they never hear from you. So definitely multiple modes, keep in good contact with them, diversify your contact methods. And then consent and assent barriers. So sometimes there can be problems with getting consent from community members. It's always important to begin early with the IRB process so that you're working with the IRB to let them know, hey, this is a particularly vulnerable population. This is a population we may have to do a different kind of consent process with. We may need to modify the consent and assent process. So work with them early on and let them know exactly what your population under study is, and they may be able to work with you on modifying that process. Okay, and there's some really excellent resources. If you're coming up with challenges, we have great resources here at the HDRUCR. So we have the Community Engagement and Dissemination Core, the CEDC, and they're really wonderful with helping you foster collaborations with the community. So definitely reach out to them. They promote community engagement in design, dissemination, implementation of research that's supported by HDR. And so their website is linked there. Also, the research infrastructure core, that's us. So once you have your study in mind, you have a community that you're connected with, we are here to help you design your study. So please see us earlier rather than later. Do not wait until the IRB is already approved and you've already collected the data. I mean, that's fine too if you need help with analysis, but we would really prefer if you reached out to us early on and said, hey, I'm not sure what kind of surveys I should be using, or how should I measure this certain thing that I want to look at. We can help you with that. We can help you with the design. We can help you with the IRB process, and then we can help you with analysis later. So reach out to us earlier rather than later, because we can really help you out with all those different steps. And then, as I said, Jenna from HARC can help you out as well. So there's a lot of really great community connections you can get there. Okay, and then beyond that, there are some great scholarly resources that I wanted to draw your attention to. So here's a great article on using community-based participatory research to address health disparities. And then this is the Hansa article that I mentioned that was really provided great tips on recruitment and understanding really from the inside on how to recruit from the inside and how to get some of those participants that are more vulnerable. And then this article too, this was Latina recruitment for cancer prevention. And this one was really interesting because it showed that when you recruit using community members, using the CBPR approach, you can target that population that you really wanted to get but really couldn't get. So they found that compared to traditional recruitment methods, when they used the CBPR approach, they got participants who were lower SES and more vulnerable and more in need of their intervention than they would have traditionally gotten if they'd used just the regular like researcher-led recruitment efforts. So that's another important resource to check out. Okay, and so in conclusion, there's just a heads up on our future workshops that I mentioned before, and definitely save the date for a workshop 4. Let's play with some data. That will be led by Jenna, and that will be on Tuesday, April 11th from 12 to 1 p.m. So thank you so much, everyone, and I'll now open it up for questions.